Chair and Vice Chair for this municipal year 2023 to 24. And I've just asked members and those present to note the confirmed appointments to the positions as agreed at full council in May. In terms of chair, that is me, Councillor Soraya Adejare, and for Vice Chair, it's Councillor Claire Joseph. Moving on to agenda item 2, welcome and apologies for absence. I'd like to welcome everyone this evening to the Living in Hackney Scrutiny Commission. Should advise that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed. Please, can you keep your microphones on mute throughout the meeting, as this will prevent audio feedback. If you'd like to speak, that includes people at the back, I will extend that opportunity to you too, considering you've given time to come here this evening. Please raise your hand to get my attention. In terms of those online, the chat function must not be used to have any conversations with other, as it's a formal meeting, and it should only be used if you wish to alert me or our technical team to a point of order or to report technical problems, and you'll be assisted in that respect. This is a formal meeting, and as such, the press may be in attendance, although not physically, possibly online, and it is being recorded, and so formal processes apply. In terms of apologies, we've received apologies from Councillor Ozen, Councillor Maxwell, Councillor Rathbone, and Councillor Ogundemuren. Online, we have Councillor Joseph, and sometime later on into the meeting, we'll be joined by Councillor Sadek. Moving on to agenda item 3, urgent items and the order of business. Are there any urgent items that anybody wishes to notify me of or those present of? No, there are none. Agenda item 4, declarations of interest. Do any members of the Commission have any declarations of interest they'd like to make? No, thank you. Moving on to agenda item 5. Cabinet question time, accountability of the housing associations and the private rent sector. The Commission's keen to hear about how the Council works with its housing association partners and the private rent sector to ensure effective accountability and protection for social housing tenants and private renters. The Commission sees this discussion as timely given the development of a shared housing compact between the Council and housing associations operating in the borough, Council's ongoing commitment to supporting private renters and challenging rogue landlords, and the recent publication of the proposed Renters Reform Bill. The Commission will be assisted in its discussions today by contributions from the Deputy Cabinet Mayor for Private Rented Sector and Housing Affordability, Councillor Semoema, and a Strategic Head of Strategy, Assurance and Private Rented Sector, James Goddard. I've done the introductions, so I'd now like to welcome you both formally to this meeting, and I'd like to invite Councillor Moema and James Goddard to give a presentation covering the key areas sent by the Commission in advance of this meeting. We'll have around 10 to 15 minutes, if you'd like to kind of take the floor, as it were.
Thank you, Councillor Adejare, and thank you very much for inviting us to your Scrutiny Commission today. So I will shortly hand over to James to run through a short presentation. I don't have background to the private sector housing function as established in 2016, and obviously there have been a lot of changes, not least building and fire safety, which were not in the portfolio previously, and also our ever-changing work around the private rented sector and the ministerial changes on that. And as you said, Chair, there has finally been some progress on the withdrawal of Section 21, so that's really welcome. Just really to say that there were four, that's my note, areas that the Commission asked us to speak to, and we're very happy to do that, but just to say from the outset that some of those may sit a little bit more comfortably with Councillor Etty. So we will obviously answer your questions, and where we're not able to, we will obviously suggest that the Commission seeks further clarification from Councillor Etty and the Homelessness and Housing Needs team. So.
Thanks, Councillor Moema. So I've got 15 minutes, Chair, which means I better get going. So Craig, if you could do that, I'll start there. Right. I've done apologies for those who've seen this about 15 times before. I thought I will do a recap because I'm not aware of where everybody is in the meeting, so we'll go through that. Apologies, you've seen this before. Right, straightforwardly, bit of background. These are rounded up, 120,000 homes in Hackney. We are hugely flatted as a borough. It's mainly flats. I put the 0.2% figure in there. Apparently we've got 240 bungalows. And that's at today's date. I think I've only seen 10 of them, but we do have 240 bungalows in Hackney. So there we are, which is a useful point. Very small size stock in terms of bedrooms. Only 5% is 4-bedroom plus. More or less, as you can see, half-half. So private renters, 30%, private owners, 30%, and the rest is social rent. I've completed council and housing association into that. Interesting point, council stock, 31,000 units. Of those 9,000 right to buy, nearly 4,000 are now, 40% are now in the private rented market. Next slide, please, Craig. Bit of rent data. This fluctuates, obviously. Key points are that these are weekly rents, not monthly, but they are weekly. They are there for comparative points. Council, 107. These are average of averages, so it's the average of everything. Housing association, about 145, and the private rented sector, 549. It is actually 600 quid a week as of today on Rightmove. So your average private sector rent in Hackney as of today from Rightmove and Zoopla is £600 a week. Private housing team, it's what the team does. And I always go through this slide because it's always a good reminder. We aim to prevent stuff. If we're enforcing, we're failing. So prevention and advice are our key points of the whole team. 32 staff in that team, of which 18 are frontline housing officers. Only 10 housing officers available. If you take 2 of those out because they're team leaders and 1 or 2 are in court, we normally have 4 or 5 housing officers available for a stock size of about 60,000 units. We do licensing. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. HMO is part of licensing. Conditions, as Councillor Noema in her introduction said, have taken over damp and mould, fire safety. Better renting campaign. We have a huge lobbying and renting campaign, not just Section 21, but rent control, capping rents, etc., etc. We are going to refresh this. We're refreshing this as we go along, but there'll be a campaign hitting the summer, which will include empty properties and things like that. More on that later. And the team members, a last port of call. We try to do everything before we enforce. Frankly, if we've enforced, we've failed. We are looking at our enforcement policy as part of our new housing strategy as we go forward across the next sort of 6, 7, 8, 9 months. You will all see it. You will all be consulted on what that new enforcement policy looks like. Yeah, do you want me to take questions as I go or at the end? Yeah. You probably can't see that up there. That's a graphic of the more pink it is, the more private rented stock we've got in Hackney. It's probably not a surprise to anybody. Other than that, we are uniformly privately rented apart from Kings Park, Hackney Wick, but it's a uniform across the piece. Slight tell, when I was a housing officer about 50,000 years ago in Hackney, we had around 3,000 units of private rented. Now we've got 35,000. It's grown hugely. Only Glasgow has outperformed us, I think, in terms of that stock price. Huge in terms of its size growth, all sorts. Next one, please, Craig. Stock condition survey of that stock, just bar, again, good revision. I know we presented this slide before, but we estimate around 11% of the stock has a Category 1 health and housing safety rating system hazard. I'll do the HHSRS in a minute. Those key hazards were reported as excess cold. You can see them up there, falls and disrepair with some fuel poverty. Note, fire safety or damp and mould were not reported picked up by surveyors at that time. Our performance generally is above the England average. That means we've got a higher end stock than the rest of England does. In reality, we also have a higher end stock than much of London. You'll see this in the coming months, not tonight. We're working through this. But where we have deprivation in Hackney, and we have a lot of it, second highest in London, it's those households that are disproportionately affected by disrepair, particularly disrepair. That's great. Fire safety. Fire safety has dominated the private sector housing team pretty much since, well, 2016, since Grenfell, basically. It's 100 tall buildings in Hackney. Every single one of those we've surveyed and inspected, all 400 in the last 5 years. Very complicated. Owners, we've had to track owners down. The owner of the address can be a postcode in Singapore. That's all we have. So we've had to use tracing agents and all sorts for a lot of this stuff, as well as the buildings themselves can be very, very complicated. Enforcement, I've got a slide on this in a moment, but enforcing against these, we've only had to enforce against 5 tower blocks in Hackney. Most of them we've got over the line, we've persuaded the owners and they're doing stuff, but 5 we have had to enforce against with threat of court action. When you go into a block, remember that since Grenfell, government has focused upon cladding. When we go into a block, we don't just pick cladding up, we pick everything up. So it's not just the cladding, it's the alarm system, fire breaks, you name it, we pick it up and we tell the owners, we enforce, you've got to deal with it. What's the point of removing the cladding if it's structurally unsafe? Government policy or lack of policy. Sorry, I know I'm supposed to be politically neutral, but this has driven me up the wall. And I know Councillor Member in her introduction said section 21, she added the word finally. We've been on at this for 4 or 5 years, let alone the fire safety stuff. Recently, Secretary of State, 6 months or so ago, clarified and pointed out that, for example, if you're a leaseholder, your costs will be capped to £15,000 price. Well, that's great if you've got £15,000 in your back pocket. They're not moving from that, and that's the baseline. So if you're a leaseholder and my team hove into view and serve a notice on your block and bill from your landlord, that's we've argued constantly against that. Myself, Councillor Noema, our view is that the polluter pays. We've put it back to government regularly, we've lobbied, and that's why it's still ongoing, as is fire safety. We have by no means overcome fire safety issues in Hackney, it's still there. Thanks, Craig. Damp and mould. So damp and mould became big. Gotta say, it became big. We've always dealt with it, but damp and mould, particularly following Rochdale, October last year. Since December, the team have had 200 cases we've had to deal with. That's way and above average damp and mould for that time frame. I'd point out that we have 100% cover for all of our damp and mould cases in Hackney. They're always dealt with initially within the 5 days. So at least that bit, remember we're dealing with this at the same time as the fire safety and all the other issues we'll get on a day-to-day basis for private sector housing. They're the sort of stuff that every single one of those referrals, complaints, what have you, requires. So inspection, identification, doing a repair spec, enforcement, landlords, etc., etc. Not just individual landlords, but housing associations as well. HHSRS, this is our main tool, just a bit of that, because I know people always ask, what is it? Housing Health and Safety Rating System is the which we categorise disrepair, etc. Currently subject to review. It's not a bad thing, but it will be tightened. Damp and mould, interestingly, under HHSRS is nearly always a category 2. The reason why it's a category 2 is because damp and mould is normally a symptom causes of damp and mould, but we put the category 1 stuff on. More on that in a moment, but that's, I've said that in the next bullet point. Interestingly, when we were talking to the Secretary of State and DLUC, they were asking us, what are our fixed penalty notices? How many do we do, et cetera, and we've said to the Secretary of State, you're asking the wrong question. We don't do fixed penalty notices. We don't just enforcement here. You can't just charge them 50 quid and then go away like a parking ticket. So in a sense, it's another issue we've had to deal with at central government. Fortunately now, they're on the case with, it should be an enforcement activity rather than just an FPN or a CPN. If you see these pictures, I'll give you an example of what a day-to-day damp and mould case looks like. I'll spend a few interesting. So this is a block in the north of Hackney. If you look on you can't really see it here, but the block is in good shape. The windows are good. They're brand new UPVC ones. So this is confusing. If you look on the left-hand side, you've got damp all over that wall. Where's it coming from? You've got some pipes there. You've got a ventilation, but there's no clear point of ingress. What's going on here? This flat was occupied by an elderly man. Housing officer goes round there. The elderly man hasn't seen his family or anyone for 15 odd years. It was also a hoarder, so we had stuff all over the place. The landlord was taking the resident to court on the basis that the resident was causing this damp. Oh, we thought. Show us the next slide, please, Craig. The landlord argued that that urn that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, which was being left on all day, was pouring constant, was actually the cause of the condensation, which was the uniform spread of damp. So the housing officer on this case has acted as a social worker, a lawyer, I'm in between the landlord and the person. So just a relatively simple case that we persuaded the landlord not to take the person to court and just deal with it, which we've done now, takes an inordinate amount of time, effort and hand-holding just for one housing officer. And we tried to, in this case, we've not had to serve a notice. We've got the job done, but that's 3 weeks almost worth of work, referrals to social care, referrals to advocates, you name it. It's a very detailed hand-holding piece of work. Cases are complicated. Next one, please.
James,
Craig.
could you just clarify, is that in PRS or is that housing association?
Private rented, it's not ours, that's a pure private rented block.
Oh, so when you're saying the housing officer, I presume you mean...
Our housing officer from private sector housing goes around there.
Yeah, great.
So this is back to fire safety. So joint inspection team is a team, a central government team, basically of fire safety and fire engineer experts. We've had 2 inspections this year alone in Hackney. The priority is fire and building safety. One block, we had to serve 70 enforcement note block. You have to serve it on each and every resident. A Housing Act enforcement notice is a minimum of 30 pages. You have to fill in every one of those pages, make sure every I is dotted, every T is crossed. The service has got to be perfect or the lawyers will get you. It's 1-0 to the other side. I have to take the entire team and put them on this one block. So during that time, seeing enforcement compliance activity, it stops. Those 70 notices took the entire team 2.5 weeks to get out the door and served. It's very, very challenging. As I pointed out earlier, we serve these notices and it's almost a double-edged sword for residents. They're glad that we're there, but we serve a 15 grand bill from your landlord. It's really difficult and it's really challenging for a lot of residents as well. It takes ongoing management, working with residents, working with the landlord, looking at all the other things, like helping landlords with their bids and you name it. It takes lots of time. I have to say that the government policy on this, lack of the resources in terms of staff, is just toxic, and it's made things worse since Grenfell happened nearly 6 years ago now. Next Wednesday, isn't it? It's something like this, yeah. Thanks, Craig. Just a bit on licensing. I know we've done this to death in this committee, but just a reminder of where licensing is quite important. Mandatory HMOs, 5 people. Additional HMOs, 3 or 4 people. That is the simple distinction between those two, is that for additional you need Secretary of State approval. Selective in those three wards, Stoke Newington, that is if you are a landlord in those wards and you want to let your property, you have to have a license. No license, no let. We are working at the moment to extend the selective licensing scheme and the additional across the whole of Hackney. And we aim to have that evidence and that argument on the Secretary of State's desk in September. It will be very challenging. I have no idea how that Secretary of State will react. It's Michael Gove, of course. We have as good an evidence-based draft at the moment as I've ever seen. We can do a bit more consultation on that, a bit more work. You will all be seeing it soon. But at the moment, we're putting the evidence base together and the argument for the extension of the selective licensing scheme across the whole of Hackney. Absolutely.
Just really quickly for the benefit of the committee and the chair. So in some local authorities, once they've had schemes in place, and in our case, our selective licensing and the scheme in the north of the borough, some authorities do a new phase, but just to reassure the committee, we are working towards keeping what we have in place and expanding rather than shifting the focus to a different part of the borough. We might want to come back to that once it's up and running in about 18 months or so, fingers crossed.
So, I mean, the Living in Hackney Scrutiny were instrumental in helping us with the first licence, etc. So, Secretary of State, wish me luck, Michael Gove in September. I'll let you know how that goes. Thanks, Craig. Empty properties, another area of work for us where we will hopefully soon be recruiting a specific empty property officer. The strategic housing market assessment indicates 2% vacancy rate in Hackney. That's all properties at any one time. So it's about 2,500 homes in Hackney are vacant at any one point. That's very low for London. It's very low. The majority of those homes will be vacant because they are up for sale. There were about 1,400 on a Zoom today. But we still have, fluctuates in my time here the last 5 years, between 5 empties. Long-term empty is a property that's been empty for 6 months or more. We are targeting those 1,000. They are complicated in many respects. We have the case there of those. Take a higher range. Take the 1,000. Of those 1,000, we did a bit of work. There are about 200, 250 of that 1,000 we can't do anything about, and we never will be able to. They're subject to probate disputes, social services, etc. You just can't touch them. You just can't do anything about those. They're through the case system, the court system, etc. But the others we will target. What, again, like with enforcement, we try to work with the owner, find out why they can't turn things around. Well, we'll give you 30 grand, you fix the roof, you let to us, etc. Bring it back. We do that. We've got a grants program, everything. But then what that doesn't give us is the agreement that we can use it, for example, as a social let. That's where the EDMO is the empty dwelling management order. These take time to put in place, but an EDMO gives us, for example, a deal with the owner that the owner lets it to us for 5, 6, 7 years, gets a standard rent in every week for that period. We do the repairs, we do the lets, no problem, go away. You know, we will manage that property. We're aiming at those, and of course, ultimately, if we possibly purchase order, in my time here, we have threatened 4, never had to do one because they've always pulled out when we've got the CPO in court. CPOs are complicated, they take a lot of time, a lot of resistance. Got a couple of live CPOs on at the moment. Whether we'll get to compulsorily purchase them, well, I hope not. You know, I hope they just come back in without us. It's very complicated because we have to buy them. So you need the money, they're never viable, etc. We tend to do back-to-back sales on the day to an RP or a charity, something like that. All of this takes a lot of lining up. Next one, please, Craig. So key challenges to private sector housing. This is the summary of everything. Staff. Haven't got enough of them, nowhere near enough. We're a smaller team than Camden and Islington, but despite having the same stock size. Councillor Member won me a great victory. First, we've got another 400 grand coming into that team. We're out to recruitment at the moment. Frankly, we're getting frontline housing staff in and 1 empty property officer, but we still need more. We are doing a new private sector housing strategy. That will be, because this sector is so important to us, we're not just doing a chapter in the council's housing strategy, but we're doing a specific piece of work alone. We're on the case. We've had our researchers out there. We've done all the evidence base for this. So the private sector housing strategy, we'll go to cabinet with the housing strategy later this calendar year. That will be a significant and high-profile piece of work. It will be the only, at this stage, standalone private sector housing strategy viable in London. So it's a really good piece of work for us. IT system is an absolute nightmare for my staff on a day-to-day basis. We lost everything in the cyber attack, and I mean everything. It's taken us 2 years to rebuild the database, get systems working. I don't understand it. A lot of it is technobabble. You know, at the moment, we still can't properly run inquiries on the system for technical reasons I don't understand. But it's getting better, but it's been an absolute nightmare. And I've touched on it, but we still have all the fire stuff, all the building safety stuff, all the damp and mold stuff, and day-to-day emergencies, illegal evictions, all that kind of thing that come through on our door. Enforcement is getting more complicated with more licensing. I say we've got a huge focus on including the housing strategy team. We're doing the licensing expansion at the moment, as well as the Home Office agency. So Afghan, Ukrainians, I've got my staff inspecting, working, in addition to all the other stuff they do, plus damp and mold. So these are serious things. Key points, easy to understand, easy to explain, but the strategy itself deals with all the other things like what the stock's looking like, what we think it will look like, where we think we need to go, where the fact of the matter is, I haven't got the data completely agreed yet. You're the first to hear this. As you probably know, residents, again, what we've never had particularly is a large-scale older people tenant group. In Hackney, we're getting much more of that, which means we've got to start looking at how we use adaptations in our homes, and all coming through on that strategy. I've just glossed over that here tonight. We're still working on that. Thanks, Greg. I'm sort of segueing things together here, Councillor Adjari, Chair. So I did it in reverse order. The next bit is the Housing Association. Did you want me to stop there? Because this, I could spend literally 6 months on private sector alone, as I'm sure you're aware.
Okay, I'll check with commission members because we have just gone slightly over time. Are you happy to have just put forward questions at this stage rather than go through another presentation? Okay, so that's how we're going to frame it. If there's a need for us to go through the presentation and we have time, if you're happy to do that, yeah? Okay, so if we start our question, the focus will be on for this section then, accountability and relationships with the private rented sector. So thank you for what you've presented so far, and I'll now hand over to commission members for their questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for a very comprehensive presentation, Councillor Moema and James. Very much appreciated. So the 400K, which we've managed to get, which is a great win. Can you just take us through what the team looked like before the 400K, how many roles there were, and what the kind of structure was, and how that has changed since the kind of 400K has come into play?
Councillor Palace. So I did have a structure slide on there. I took it out of the presentation. So you'll have to let me explain it. The team at the moment has 32 members of staff. Yeah, it has more or less a tripartite function. One is enforcement, compliance and licensing. One is DFGs and grants, and one is the business support team. So they're like the three pillars of the service, okay? So
Could you say that just one more time? Sorry, I didn't.
right, so the first, imagine three pillars with the head of service. The first pillar on the left-hand side is your enforcement, your housing officer staff. They will deal with fire safety, damp and mold, licensing, compliance, like all of those things. They're the qualified environmental health officers who sit on that side of them. They're around, they fluctuate around 18 to 22 of those normally, okay? The middle pillar, a separate team, is the grants, the disabled facilities grants team. So again, that team does the adaptations, giving grants to people to maintain their independence, to live in their own homes and things like that. It comprises essentially some housing officers and some surveyors. There are about 6 people in that team. And then we have the business support team, who are exactly what it says on the tin. So they provide the admin, the clerical support essential to the functioning of the service and the other 2 teams. Within that first pillar, Councillor Palace, so the first pillar is your housing officers, the environmental health officers. That bit we divide up. So some officers will work on, like the more fire safety stuff across the borough. Some will be working more or less on licensing up in those 3 wards, and others will be a more generic prevention service across the borough. Yeah, but we don't sort of have that split up completely. Any member of that team should and could be able to work at any other point when they are needed. That's where the resources are required. I'm not pulling punches on this. I will be recruiting housing officers for that team. We've got to look at our job descriptions and what we're paying. It is actually, sadly, a competitive market. Hackney has fallen slightly behind in the salaries we offer our environmental health officers and some of the conditions around the edge. For example, things like training. I hear that Islington are now offering golden handshakes to environmental health officers. It's hugely competitive. We've gone out to market, we'll see what we get. If we don't get environmental health officers, I have a plan B and a plan C, which includes, for example, using housing officers who aren't environmental health officers to serve notices. That can be done. So there'll just be a bit of work around this, but let's just see what we get in. We hope to have the initial tranche done by September.
Can I just clarify, so there's 32 members of staff currently? In total, and what was that before the 400K, or has the numbers stayed the same?
It's the same. It's been 28. It's been 36 at the moment. As of today, I've got 32 people.
And so, what is the 400,000 kind of going towards? What is?
Depends how we cut it, but we will get about 6 housing officer staff and 1 empty property officer. Those 6 housing officer staff, we want a team leader as well as some housing officers, but we could do it different ways.
So that'd be on top of the 32?
In addition.
Also add that within the team, I think we've struggled to fill a paralegal role. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so that's something that we obviously go through the budget setting process every year, and we've held that role. But it's very difficult to get a paralegal to do actually what's quite a specialised piece of work. So we're looking at whether or not we have somebody who is a fully qualified lawyer to sit in the team. At the moment, some of those services are centralised to the monitoring officers team and corporate. But in order to progress things like the cases that might be taken by an empty homes officer, supporting people. I've sat through tribunals with housing officers, and I've seen the work that they do. They sit for a whole day in court after 6 or 7 weeks of preparing evidence and canvassing the streets as well. So more capacity. So we're not going to have a huge expansion, but it releases some very specialised officers to not be doing that work, and it means that we can see things through to completion. And in addition to that, as I said at the beginning, when we restarted the function in 2016, it was to protect the function, but also things like Homes for Ukraine, Afghan resettlement, every single private sector, every single person who's in the borough has had the place that they're living inspected. And we want, despite what the government says, we want to make sure that our refugees and asylum seekers living here are living in decent homes. So we will continue to do that. And obviously building and fire safety is both reactive but also proactive. So we've moved a bit from reactive, but if we hear that there is a building that has particular concerns, then every single person in the team has to drop what they're doing and focus on that. So it will mean that business as usual can continue.
Okay, well, Councillor Joseph and then Councillor Garbutt.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, James, for the presentation there. Hello. So I suppose as councillors, we do often come across cases where landlords are flouting the rules, as you mentioned, attempting things like banned evictions during COVID, or indeed the unlicensed HMOs, where things like room divisions have caused quite substantial fire risks to our residents. So I suppose I just want to get an idea of what enforcement actually means. So where you've come across a HMO that is unlicensed, and we've let you know, or someone else has let you know, I mean, what are the steps, what are the penalties for the landlord who's sort of exploiting people there, really? If you could just sort of talk us through the steps that you take and how we kind of, I'd like to understand exactly what the penalties are, I suppose, to sort of put them off repeat offences. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Joseph. So what we always try to do first is talk to the landlord and talk sense into them, just sort it. Like, that's the first port of call, understanding, working out what the situation is, whatever it is, whether it's, you know, unlicensed, dodgy HMO. We hear all sorts of stories. I forgot to do it. You know, I didn't do this, or what have you. Sometimes people generally did forget, or they missed it, and they do cough up and blah, blah, blah. But the first point of call for a housing officer is the investigation, field work, go around there, talk to tenants, talk to blah, 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 and try and resolve it informally outside of a system, okay? That's what we do. And in most cases, that's how we start it. And in many cases, that's how we end it as well, in truth. If we, and sadly, of course, that not everybody's like that, not everybody's reasonable, in which case we will start down the enforcement path. Depending upon whatever the case is, enforcement can be anything from a criminal sanction to a fixed penalty fine. So one of the things, fixed penalty fines, 500 quid, stuff like that, you can argue that they are not deterrent enough. I wouldn't disagree with you, but that's how the system works. It's one of the things we've lobbied against. There are things you can get some unlimited fines for, but they tend to be fire safety where there's a risk to life. Enforcement action, for example, I'll give you a classic case. What we often get is the boiler's not working. Yeah, we've spoken to the landlord. We say fix the boiler, fix the hot water. A week, 2 weeks later, this is in February, January, whatever. We still haven't got a boiler fixed, etc. Notice is served. The notice requires that landlord to fix the boiler. A week later, we hear the boiler still hasn't been fixed. We've then got to do a court application. The court application will take forever, even though it's, so none of this stuff is ideal. What we can do then ourselves is we will do works in default. That means we will get into the property and we'll change the boiler ourselves. Again, that's not straightforward. Sometimes if the tenant's not there, the locks are changed, you have to crash through the door, you have to have police present, etc., etc. We change the lock. The landlord says, I can't pay, I'm skint, things like that. So there the fines rack up. You can get £2.5 grand on things like that. But again, sometimes you just can't get the money out. So the system itself is problematical. And this is why we lobby for much more in the way of the actual the powers. This is ruining people's lives. The other element also is you'll hear sometimes that it does actually happen of revenge evictions. What we've had in Hackney, more than one, where tenants are often asking us to do what we can to fix a boiler without serving a notice. And we get this quite a lot. And we have to play it very, very carefully, because that tenant ultimately can get evicted. Yeah, with a Section 21, 4 weeks' time, you're out. And we don't get the boiler fixed and things like that. So it's never straightforward in these cases. We have around, frankly, 500 to about 1,000, let's be straightforward, not just rogue, but criminal landlords in Hackney that we've dealt with in the 5 years that I've been here. Every one of those has been a court case. None of it has been straightforward. What we are doing as part of our strategy is we are reviewing our tariff. So these are the charges that we will fine a landlord with. At the moment, we're about in the middle of the London market. A boiler, for example, is 550 quid. We're going to push that up to the 750, 850 mark. Number one, we'll take a view, and we will carry on lobbying for more extensive powers and quicker timescales as part of the rent reform bill. The rent reform bill does not touch upon this at all. They've missed a trick. I can talk a long time on this. We average around 350 to 550 quid financial penalty. If you're a landlord, it isn't that much of a deterrent.
Can I just quickly add, Chair? So although the council doesn't itself provide legal advice to tenants, if we are party to a hearing, so there was the very well-known case of the Somerford Grove renters, where we were an interested party to that. So we didn't give advice, but we had an interest in following the case. And there have been a few others like that, but that's the one that's kind of made the press with the LRU. We do, through another portfolio, there is funding that the council has given to, I think, a broader range of providers. Historically, it was mainly the law centre, but that's been expanded to include Shelter, the Citizens Advice Bureau, and Praxis. And I think the expansion is really important for members to understand the reasons behind that, primarily because there's a broader range of, for example, languages and communities that are better reached through a broader range of organisations. So there is, if not more money within the system, there is a broader range of places which receive some grant funding from the council, which people can. It's not far from ideal, because we would all love a bigger pot of money to start with, but people can go to a different range of third sector organisations to get that advice around housing, because we know that there isn't a legal aid anymore necessarily for people that have housing issues.
It is on that point, Councillor Member raised, for example, and that is a really good example of it. The Somerford Grove, where the residents actually obtained rent repayment orders. The rent repayment order is effectively you can get your rent back for about a period of a year. They still haven't been paid. Now that is because the ease with which a landowner can challenge that in the High Court and, declare themselves bankrupt, change their company structure, everything else. The system, I did mention it, is toxic and difficult here. It is toxic and it is difficult. So even where you get a win, in inverted commas, through supporting residents, it's never straightforward. And that's a shame, and that's an indictment.
Okay, thank you. Is there a follow-up, Councillor Joseph? No. No, okay, I'll move on to Councillor Garber. Thank you.
Thank you. I did have a similar kind of question based on borough licensing, but I'm just really happy to hear that you're going to get that application in, and I wish you all the best as Secretary of State. I'm going to ask, I'll ask another question on the empty properties, which I think is really interesting. And I just wondered if you had just a kind of target or a concept of how many of those homes you might be able to, is it work? I suppose it's a trajectory. Is it work that we've accelerated recently? Is it work that just kind of trickles on and you get the same kind of numbers coming through and back into use, that kind of stuff? Thank you.
So if I just quickly start. So we actually did have an empty homes officer in place before the pandemic, and it was within the 2016 to 20 manifesto. I feel like it was, I actually can't pick up, the number is in the document, but it was in the region of about 300, but it was less, that person's function was to identify how many empty homes there actually are, So if you discount the properties that James has talked about, which are in probate and legal issues or are covenanted and all that sort of stuff, that takes out a huge chunk of stuff. And so I know I actually bumped into somebody, I spoke to somebody rather at a meeting about 2 weeks ago, and they talked to me about a property in Listria Park in Hackney. And they were saying this property has been empty for a number of years. And I spoke to you, it's like, I know, I've seen that casework. I remember that you wrote to me 3 years ago, but this is the situation. So that, in terms of the council, there is a legal issue around that particular property. As soon as it comes, but we know that because we did have somebody to do that piece of work. So obviously, a secondary issue that I think I have, and I think as councillors we all should have, is the age profile of the workforce. They won't thank me for saying this, but they are very experienced staff, but that means that they're kind of in the halcyon days of working as council officers, the very experienced environmental health officers. And so we need to start to develop a bit more of a pipeline of people. I'd be quite keen to see even apprentices coming into that team, but there are different conversations to be had with unions and others. But in terms of where we go with an empty homes officer, it will be a mixture of a desk-based exercise and then also looking at, once you've identified if a property is empty and its ownership, if it can be brought into use, and then from there, who, if you like, gets it, whether it goes to another private sector tenant and is managed in one part of the council, whether it goes into general needs or whether it goes into temporary accommodation. After that, kind of it goes back, where it goes into a pot is secondary, but the main thing is just having an understanding of how many. So we guesstimate based on the previous work, it's about 1,000, but we haven't, per range rather, 1,000. More realistically, I think probably about 500. But it's worth just saying that because of the restrictions around COVID, officers were not able to investigate apart from if it was an emergency situation. And it's very hard to have that unless it's kind of life and death at that point. So the focus has been on doing the things that officers can do, like working through the damp and mold, fire safety, and then more latterly Homes for Ukraine. And as that's kind of easing off, we're back onto actually focusing on what was that core commitment to continue to identify those properties, but with the additional resource, we will have the staff capacity to actually investigate and actually bring them back into use like we promised.
Just a quick addendum to that. So Councillor Garbutt, just straight to your point, the starting point for the number is the council tax database. We'll start there. We'll get a number from there. Each one of those then needs to be investigated, and that's field work. It's with one empty property officer as opposed to a team, you've just got to prioritise. So we'll go for the hard one, the ones we know about first, rather than walk around 1,000, bang on a door and see who's there and what's not there. You know, it would take me a team. We could do that, and I've done that before. We've had a team of 4 people. It's very specialist work as well. The enforcement on an empty is different to the enforcement on a normal, the broken boiler, or an illegal eviction, for example. You use different forms of legislation. You have different ways of doing things. Particularly doing an EBMO is a very specialist work, so we will get a specialist officer in. As Councillor Moema has said, at the moment, looking at the council tax database, we make an estimate of around about 500 properties in Hackney that have been empty for more than 6 months. Take 250 of those out, we think we've got about 250 to 300. And we will do everything. It's not just a case of us sitting there in silence. The other part of the empty property thing is you get a budget together, so you stick posters up outside Hackney Central. You know, landlords are coming for you, stuff like that. We'll do that. So you will see stuff in Hackney on billboards, on the side of our vehicles and everything else. So there is a campaign here as well. Empty properties can be really, really complicated. Even when it doesn't fall into probate, you've got disrepair, you have family issues, you've got the kids don't want us to put an order on it, all those sorts of things. It can be very difficult, and that's where the hand-holding and the caseworking comes in. Last port of call is the enforcement.
Thank you. Excuse me, I've just got a quick question in respect of, damp and mould and 5 working day time frame for appointments. Particularly in respect, I currently represent a ward that does have a licensing scheme in place. But my concern relates to the fact that this may not necessarily be a time frame that is always realised. So is this now a gold standard that the department is working to? Likewise, in respect of other safety issues where there's risk to life, immediate risk to life, what sort of timeframes would we be looking at there?
So immediate risk to life, councillor, is immediate. So it's drop everything and get out there then and there. So if it is an immediate risk to life or limb, there is it's not just the private sector housing team, there's a council response to that, which will include the emergency service under James Groom and all that, but often they'll refer it to us and we'll get a housing officer out there. Invariably, that's things like structural collapse, gas, and what have you. But we get the housing officer, as we did on Stokenton High Street. The housing officer was there and then, and you just drop everything. It's life and then you deal with it there and there. Damp and mould, as you know, awful as it is not necessarily an immediate 2-hour response. It's not considered an immediate danger, so we don't do it within 2 hours. We don't even do it within 24 hours unless it's really serious. The council has a standard that's across not just private sector housing, but council housing as well, of a 5-day inspection, contact, what have you, for all damp and mould cases. I don't have the figure for the council. I know that Kane Roach, the repair manager of the council stock, was telling me that last month they had a 100% response to all council damp and mould cases. Private sector housing, we've had a 100% response for a 5-day window in all damp and mould cases since December. What that means in practice is the housing officer will talk to you, go around there, investigate, etc. It won't mean they'll necessarily solve it within 5 days because of the complexity of the case, but we will be there within 5 days. We triage them as well, Councillor, because at the moment we are actually inundated and overwhelmed with damp and mould. Some of the photos that I see, frankly, we won't be around there within 5 days. You're lucky if we'll be around there within 28 days. They're not a priority at all. So we do triage them. We triage them, first of all, through photographic evidence on what the officer knows about the block on that, and we do it on that basis.
Sorry, I know that there's complexities in terms of dealing with damp and mould, but in terms of the timeframes that are allocated to our landlords to respond, is there a kind of...
Yeah, so it would depend. Yeah, again, it does depend upon what the damp and mould stuff is. If it's life or limb, you've got to deal with it within 24 hours. End of story. Yeah, and that may involve moving residents out, you know, all those sorts of things, but that's the 24 thing. If it is a category 1, so that is also life or limb and things like that. Category 1 is really urgent. We'll expect you to deal with it, quote, immediately. So we give them a bit more leeway than 24 hours. Problem with damp and mould is that if it's being caused, for example, by serious water penetration 3 floors above you, immediate becomes a bit more complicated. So what we'd look for is, in that case, for example, that you are moving the resident into not just a crappy B&B in Middlesbrough, but somewhere decent. You've got to have a response. If you don't respond immediately, we will intervene within a suitable period. That can be 2, 3, 5 days, 10 days. It depends upon the case, but it is a quick response. Generally, so far, of those 200 cases that we've had, what I didn't say in the presentation is we have not yet had a category 1 damp and mould issue in Hackney since December in the private rented sector. Plenty of category 2s and plenty of category 1 stuff that's causing the damp and mould that we're dealing with.
In terms of category 2, these things can eventually become a category 1 being the highest level. I think that's my concern, particularly in respect of vulnerable people, people with families and so forth. We don't want a repeat of any cases that have been witnessed in other parts of the country. So just in terms of ensuring, I think I just want to understand the methodology in terms of your approach to landlords. At what stage of them being given instructions and there being delays in landlords carrying out these instructions will we take action? Is there a time frame that we work to in that respect in both category 1 and category 2?
Yes, so we have in the policy a set series of timescales, but in practice it's down to the housing officer judgment. So last week we had, you may find, why isn't that a category 1? We went around to the property where there were sprouting mushrooms, fruiting mushrooms, so there were spores in the air. We gave the landlord, but by the end of, I think it was by the end of the next day, it was about 36 hours to deal with the mushrooms. Yeah, the policy says 5 days. Yeah, so there is an element of judgment within there. The element is set out within the HHSRS system itself. So it tells you what you've got to deal with within 2 hours, what you've got to deal with within 24 hours, 5 days, 10 days, and 28 days. That's our system. It's standard across the UK. I can take you through that in more detail, but we do hit that. There is, however, the element of interpretation and judgment. We talk to the landlord immediately. Sometimes you can't get hold of the landlord. Sometimes the landlord is being a bit of a pain in the backside and doesn't want to talk to you. That point, so on the mushrooms, we did serve a notice last week. That was a housing association councillor, to make it even worse.
Thank you for that. Is it a follow-on or? Okay, I've got Councillor Selman, then Councillor Joseph.
Do we track in terms of like case progress, so as well as having a figure of like the automatic KPI, or do we also have like, an ongoing checking how many open cases do we have? So obviously there's a bit of discretion there, but track it to work out, do we need to do a dip sample of things not just being left hanging? So that's something we can do.
Hi, Councillor Selman. Yeah, so we have a case system. We would have had a case system going back from 10 years, but we've lost it since the housing effective case system lasting the last 2.5 years, basically. But yeah, those 200 cases I mentioned, there's actually 198 open damper mold cases on the system for the team at the moment, divided across the team. We've closed down about a further 150. So yes, we do. It's done through our housing management system, and they would, if, as I said earlier on, I don't know why the system can't query properly at the moment. That's a piece of techno-babble that I just don't understand, and I couldn't explain it here. But we hope within 6 months that that's a fully functioning private sector housing management system, so you can get the query. We're having a bit of difficulty just querying stuff at the moment, but we do have a housing system. It's also done manually by the housing officer as well. But yeah.
I think this would be a really welcome intervention from the Commission on the service, and I think rightly, when the cyber attack happened, there were some things which were absolutely essential, like getting people's payments to them, benefits and so on, to make sure that those were the priority systems. One of the fallouts from the cyber attack was the prioritisation that we had. So the private sector housing team, because I suppose people are housed and so on, it was less of a priority than somebody, for example, who was in council stock. So I think in terms of a level of equity in how we, even if we don't have a landlord function ourselves in the private rented sector, and also segue into your next session about housing associations and leaseholders, shared owners in particular, but I think that's something which in our systems we should have a level of clarity, and I think similar tech which allows us to properly interrogate the data. And we've started from, basically the whole service had to start from ground zero, is what I'm saying, after the cyber attack. And I think we'll get back to a point where we can have clear data sets. One thing that we're looking at with using the opportunity to re-look at all of our stock, and do that in great depth, which members that were here before know that we did before licensing anything. But I think that level of granularity will be helpful, not just to the Commission, but I think to officers as well. And it will allow you to interrogate much more fully if we have that parity between, for example, homelessness and housing needs that's managed by the council, and the functions and the tech, if you like, that officers have in the private sector housing team have. And I know there's been a delay post cyber attack, but that is a real, is a factor in speed, which again, hopefully will be dealt with by additional staff, but also part of that money will go to better tech and something which is a bit more robust than we had last time.
20 seconds addition to that. I mean, brutally, not simplistically, but brutally put, figures at the beginning, there are around 34,000 units of stock in the private rented sector. I've got 32 members of staff, of whom 18 are housing officers. There are 32 minus 9,000, i.e. 25,000 units of council stock. We've got about 100 staff there just working on that. That's the difference. With Hackney, if we extend the licensing scheme across the whole of Hackney, those properties are under our management. End of story. That's all of us in this room. They are then under the management of this council.
Thank you. So data sets not available yet, but they will be moving forward. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. My question's on fire safety. In light of the recent major fire in the Tower Hamlets HMO, which was in what was initially intended to be a 2-bedroom, I believe it was an ex-council flat, that actually housed about 20 people. Are we able, and I do appreciate that your team is under a lot of, probably quite a lot of stress and has more cases than they can deal with. But are we able to proactively and regularly inspect known HMOs, particularly to ensure that any materials they may be using to divide rooms are fire safe? Thanks.
So on HMOs, Councillor, the answer is yes, under the additional scheme. So these could be famous last words, but we do inspect HMOs, and as part of the licence, there is a significant element of fire safety in terms of the survey and the test. Yes, we do, and yes, we should. Selective licensing will make that easier because it's really clear in the selective licence, like with the additional one, that you test for fire safety as well. Generally speaking, the risks that we have on our moment in terms of fire safety are not so much the HMOs, but the big blocks. And that's where a lot of the team focus has been over the last 2, 3, 4 years, for obvious reasons. I don't want to tempt fate here, but by and large, I see the figures on HMOs. Yes, we've had some compartmentation risk with HMOs, but we've got all of the other issues as well. We tend to deal with those. Your question is, do we proactively manage those risks? I've got to be straightforward and say the team is too small to proactively manage the whole of the borough. I've got to be straightforward there. The areas where we do have proactive management are every Thursday, once a month, in the 3 selective licensing wards, where we go and do an activity day. That means I send about 5 or 6 officers up into those wards just to walk around the streets, banging on doors, talking to residents and picking stuff up. With more staff, I could do more of that. With a licensing scheme, again, this is one of the things I didn't touch upon, but with a licensing scheme that's extended across the whole of Hackney, I was working in another East London borough where we extended the licensing scheme across the whole borough, and we had 45 staff just dealing with that licensing scheme. So they're the kind of the levels that you need to deal with a stock size that we would be dealing with. You get a lot more scope to do things proactively when they're all under license and you've got enough resources. At the moment, we don't have either.
Thank you, James. Councillor Palace, unless Councillor Joseph had a follow-up? No, I'm assuming not, no. Okay, thank you, Councillor Palace.
Great, I presume that was Newham. Because so is Newham the only James that you were referring to? Okay, it's another borough. Because as I understand, Newham is the only borough in the country that has a selective licensing scheme to the whole of the borough at the moment. Or is that not correct?
No. In London,
yeah.
So I was at another borough to the east of Newham called Barking and Dagenham. We did it across the whole borough. Enfield has one, Waltham Forest. So Liverpool, they're around the place now. So yes, again, the key point, Councillor Price, is that you have to persuade the Secretary of State for these things.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So at the moment, from what you're saying, the officers don't cover a set geographical area. If we, in our current model with the additional 7 staff, could we get, for example, officers set for those 3 selective licensing wards? That's one request. If we got the approval from the Secretary of State, do you imagine we would have officers set for set geographical areas who would just do proactive work in that?
Are you saying that people should have
Patches.
patches, like housing officers, like council housing officers?
Yes.
Shall I take it, Councillor? Do you want?
And
Okay,
then
we
because
can
I'm
review,
just because it's a kind of request thing, rather than necessarily a question. But and then just on reporting, could we as councillors get an update, I don't know, every 3 months on what enforcement has happened within our ward? And finally, I don't know if this will be available at this moment in time, but it'd be really helpful to have an idea of how many properties we believe could either come under the selective licensing scheme and the other elements where people have to sign up, which is the HMO element. And so how many there could be, and how many are how many landlords are actually signed up. Now, I guess you don't mostly have those exact figures now, but if you could send them to scrutiny committee, that'd be really helpful. So yes, quite a few things there, but they're kind of request things, as it were. You can note them. You don't have to get back to all of them.
So just a couple of those. So even with the data loss, you can probably, the committee's staff could quite easily reverse engineer how many licenses that landlords there are from the number of licenses issued through the fees and charges schedule that comes forward with everything else every year. So I think that would be relatively straightforward, and that's in the public domain. My personal view, this has not been discussed, so I'm just working on the fly here, but I'm not sure that it would be efficient or particularly exciting for an officer to be given a patch to deal with just that thing. And I think whilst there are equivalences, they're not the same as council housing officers that we have here in Hackney, in that the enforcement officers they're specialised. James has said that they're qualified EHOs, and they don't have to be, but ours are, which means that when they qualify, they have to choose a specialism. So it would make no sense, for example, to have somebody covering a patch, let's say my ward, Hackney Downs, and they are dealing with building and fire safety, and we have 3 tower blocks. Do you see what I mean? It would not be the best use of very limited resource. And also, they just operate in they have a different relationship with the landlords, just by the very fact that the landlord is not the council. And so I think we would fetter the discretion of those officers in that team. We would, I think, unnecessarily inflate the numbers that we actually need, which is always my challenge back to James and others, that we need to spend the money that we have been allocated and demonstrate effectiveness before we come back and ask for more. But if we do need more resources, then it should go to the right places. So on that map that was shown at the beginning, there's a high concentration of private sector housing in the south of the borough, and there's a lower concentration of private sector housing in the far east of it, in Kings Park. But that's because Kings Park is essentially all southern housing. That's not to say that there aren't issues in Kings Park, and it would therefore be unfair that Kings Park didn't get any officers, and Hoxton East and Hoxton West and de Beauvoir got loads of officers, when perhaps their housing stock might actually be quite decent, but there's just more of it. So I think we need to think about the complexity.
Reasons we used to have, the teams used to operate on patch license, Councillor Palace, about 20 years ago, but for reasons Councillor Moema said, we moved away from it. We are going to do a review of the team structures and how it works later this year. Let's get the staffing first and get on with the job first of all, but we're going to have a look at that. We will, again, formally look at the patch thing, but it may not go ahead for the reasons Councillor said. But we did, you getting stuck in the patch sizes where they is. One of the things we're also doing is merging private sector with the council's housing team. So if you were a housing officer in a patch, you dealt with everything in your patch. It doesn't work. It's never worked. So we've looked at. But your point's a good question. There are some advantages to it. We just felt that the disadvantages outweighed it, which is why there is no patch-based private sector housing team approach I'm aware of in the UK at the moment, but we'll have a look at it. Your question also about how many properties would fall within the licensing schemes, all of them.
Question was how many, obviously they all do, but it's about how many are actually signed up within those 3 wards. So,
within the 3 what have been licensed?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're running about 85%.
Okay, so so the question was I won't take up any more time on this. This is how we get to 200. Yeah.
Final point on that, which I didn't make, is that licensing schemes last for a 5-year period. That's the period you have a scheme in place for before you need to reapply. So the target is always to get those 100% of properties within, whether it's whole borough or a ward, licensed within a 5-year period before you need Secretary of State approval yet again. So those 3 wards, we unfortunately we were hit by as Councillor said, 2 years with nothing basically, but we've caught up. The money's come in, the licenses are there, we're ahead of trajectory.
So we will be moving on to housing associations shortly, but mine's just a very, very quick one, because I'm hearing limited resources. So in terms of expansion of the licensing scheme, in leading to that, I'm interested to learn about whether there's been a development of the private sector tenants working forum, which will involve officers and council. I think it's important in terms of strategic outlook and also in terms of understanding the experiences of those living in private sector accommodation more holistically, more so as they're often out there on their own. They're often limited tenancies, so here for a brief period of time, some of the issues that they're immediately impacted by, we may not have the timeframes to address those in the immediate term, and it exists a filter onto the next tenant or resident. So is that something that's being progressed amidst the work that you're currently doing?
I'll be really straightforward and hand over to Councilman will say no. What he meant to say was, right, so two things. We have a landlord forum, Councillor, just so that exists in terms of forums where we work with landlords to try and do things. The disadvantage is the sorts of landlords you want at the forum don't attend the forum. That's always an issue with these sorts of, that's been there. Tenant involvement through tenant forums and stuff is really, really challenging. Okay, so we are going to, when I say relaunch it, about the third time I've been here, we are relaunching our tenant forum without giving a precise date. It'll be sometime in summer when we've got all of the evidence base together. They are very difficult to keep continuity, Councillor Adjari, as you can imagine, because of churn. People don't want to stick their head above the parapet, all those sorts of things. But we have had tenant forums before. Every borough I've worked in, they've been very difficult to keep going for various reasons. Our aim is to look at our, for want of a better phrase, partnership structure and working within private sector over the next 3 months or so, and then get it back out there. We have got a landlord forum. It's the same shape as it was 5 years ago, so there's a bit of improvement there.
Yeah, so just to build on that, we do, yes, as James says, we do have that forum. I think it's really important for the Commission, I'm sure you know, but for those at home, we rely really heavily here in Hackney on our private landlords, the good ones who provide temporary accommodation to our homeless households and enable people to stay in the borough. So the primary focus of the existing forum is to speak to those landlords. They do great things like they learn about safeguarding their tenants, particularly for vulnerable tenants. But as James says, the ones that should sign up are the ones that take all of the extra time to go and find who they are and where necessary to enforce against them. One of the things that we promised in the manifesto was to work a bit more closely and strategically, because there was, I think, helpful, constructive criticism and points well made by people like London Renters Union about our engagement. I would say about engaging with tenants, and we should and could do more. And so the expansion in the service is partly a response to that. The one thing that I continue to caution against when I speak to people is that our private rented sector, the average private sector tenant is not a 30-something that lives in a house share and works in creative industries, which is the stereotype of somebody here. It is somebody who is on slightly above minimum wage, who probably is in partial receipt of housing benefit and lives in a property. They may or may not be a single parent household, but they are doing well financially on paper, but they are very, very precarious, particularly in light of the increases that we have. And they tend to be, I would say, late middle age. And so my concern about people in the private rented sector aging in place and being able to figure out how they can deal with a fixed income when they are struggling already is uppermost in all of our minds in the team. And so at any forum that we have, that is always the challenge to it, that we need to make sure that it's representative, not just in terms of those income and socioeconomic dynamics, but very much, and I've said this kind of shape, continue to say this, in terms of its racial and gender breakdown, as well as employment status. It's absolutely essential. If we're going to have one that's sustainable and really shapes policy here, then it needs to do all of those things. And I would not want to, so I think what we have at the moment works for us, because we are beginning to establish standing invitations and conversations with stakeholders who've been really helpful in getting us to this point and pushed us here, like LRU, but also Hackney Citizen, who are a little bit more church-based and have a slightly older member profile. And then just be able to listen to the voices of young people who are growing up in this borough and are concerned about where they will live, and their parents are, but you know, at the moment with the cost of living crisis, are living hand to mouth.
Thank you. Some quick. I do think it's incredibly important that as many voices as possible in terms of our residents in the private sector are heard. So I'm glad that that's happening, particularly as was pointed out very early on. Many are on low incomes, and likewise, due to falls in funding for public sector housing, more and more of our residents are directed to the private sector as a consequence. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have TRAs or anything of that nature, so I do sincerely hope that this is something that all would caress as your work develops. So thank you. Sorry, got Claire. And
No,
then
I don't want to put them on the spot, but I wondered if the people in the audience, did you have any questions? Did you want to ask anything? No? I just thought it might be a good point before we go on to the next bit.
Sorry,
Can I
Councillor
just say,
Josie.
if there are any particular suggestions that the Commission has around that very important point that you spoke to, we'd be really happy to receive them. And we may kind of look at them and then reject them, but it will be on the basis of reason rather than we don't like them, but really open to suggestions.
Can I ask a quick question? Have we asked tenants what might work? Have we done that bit? Have you said, you know, like...
Yes, so the short answer is yes. The problem is, no, it's not like nobody responds, but given the size of that body of people, the responses are very, very often extremely unrepresentative, I think. And so I feel, as the lead member, quite often uncomfortable with leaning into what might be a heavily skewed response to a particular situation, which might fit the demographics of one part of our borough, but is not actually, you can't actually extrapolate it to the average. And I kind of go back to that point about, we don't really have people, for example, over 50 who have participated in anything that I have seen. And yet that's a huge cohort of people in the private rented sector because they're just kind of going about their business. So we need to find better ways of asking people rather than surveying them. And I don't know what that is, but what we have done so far has, I think it has its limits on how effective it is.
Thank you. Got Councillor Joseph and then Councillor Selman.
Thank you, Chair. I think my question is quite well aligned with the Chair's remarks there about the residents' voice and supporting vulnerable residents in the PRS. So often, as a councillor, and I'm sure your team too, will come across people who have issues that aren't solely related to the private rented sector, or perhaps they're a bit tangled up. So I've had elderly people who are not receiving any pension or any benefits. If they were, they'd be able to pay the rent. So the issues are all intertwined. And sometimes it seemed to me that the council, and this isn't a criticism of your department, it's actually found across council departments, aren't always the best at speaking to one another. So sometimes something's dealt with, one aspect of an issue is dealt with, but it's not necessarily dealt with in the round. And I just wondered how you shared information with other teams and other departments. Do you make referrals into other teams or things like adult social care or housing needs? I mean, do you regularly participate in sort of multidisciplinary meetings, or is it more on a sort of ad hoc basis? I'm just wondering how you sort of talk to one another. Bearing in mind, of course, that you have a very busy daily workload. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Joseph. So almost every single case I've seen this year has had some form of referral to adults or to BHN or both. There are formal referral routes. There are formal meetings, there are case meetings, etc., but inevitably there is still a degree of fragmentation because of how the council is structured and how it works. Again, that would also be something potentially for Scrutiny to look at and make recommendations, because you're here into the big structural issues that would add value. Some of it, of course, depends upon the not just following referral routes, because referral routes can only take you so far in terms of process, policy and protocol. Frankly, some of it is also about relationships and what the housing officer and the social worker do and don't know. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge. But at this stage, Councillor, as I say, this year, every single case I've seen, I don't think there's been any exception to this, except for the disrepair ones. And even then, quite a few of those has had both adult and some form of involvement from BHM. The referral routes are well placed at this stage. There is some value to look at those and how it's, you know, and make recommendations. But your point's correct. It comes back to my point at the beginning about the complexity of these cases. That picture that I showed you that had police involvement, MAPA, it had landlords, it had the housing officer ending up acting as the glue between all of those different parts, which is why that one case took virtually 3 weeks alone because of a bloody kettle on an oven. You know, this gives you the size of the complexity and the challenge that we face.
Councillor, okay, go ahead, sorry.
Thank you, James. I do appreciate that. I suppose I mean, I wouldn't speak for every councillor, but for myself, I suppose I find myself in that role as well, very often, trying to join up the different council departments. And that can prove very time consuming and quite frustrating because, you know, we're not social workers either. So I suppose maybe we do need to consider, is there a way that, you know, the most serious cases we can make sure that they're being scrutinised by all the right people together in a room? Would there be like any housing review meeting that ever takes place on a regular basis where all the aspects are involved, including housing services and housing needs and PRS? Is that something that ever happens?
So I'll hand over to James really quickly, but I just, your question, I agree entirely with what you said. One thing I would add is that I meet with James and other officers, very short meetings, but fairly religiously on a weekly basis to get updates on what's happening. And the slightly confusing, but hopefully now clearer split between mine and Councillor Etty's portfolios means that there is often conversation which will bleed into, for example, a homelessness case, but and particularly when you get things like a homeless household has been discharged into the private rented sector. Ultimately, what we want to do is to keep as many people in the homes that they have so that there is limited movement unless people want to do so. And then separately, there is, you know, a political focus around minimising discharge into the private sector where we can by identifying those empty homes. That is hopefully the logic, which hopefully is now clearer. But I think the reality is often, which I think is some of your frustration as a commission reflected back to us as lead members, is why isn't this happening? And I think from an officer perspective, very simply, if you're in homelessness and housing need and the private sector housing team approach you about somebody who is having a problem with their property, the fact is that person has a house to live in. And when you think about the number of people on the waiting list behind you, it's a question for each team to be looking at their priorities. And I completely agree that there should be more link up with social services and proper support. And I think post-pandemic, we need to think about how we identify people. I would say that one of my frustrations and a concern, which was actually assuaged a lot because I was reassured that we were dealing with it, but when we were identifying vulnerable residents during the pandemic, that relied fairly heavily on people who are council or housing association residents. And then we kind of had to do a workaround, as is quite often the case in the private sector housing team, to encourage people to come forward. And I think you're absolutely right. So if there's more, we would welcome the very soft kicking, we hope, from your commission about how to do that better in the future, because I completely agree with you, Councillor Joseph.
Just a quick one, Councillor Joseph. So if in doubt, just refer the case through to private sector housing team, number one. That's the first port of call. The housing officer generally will act as the SPOC, the single point of, et cetera, We try to minimise handoffs, but using the example Councillor Memmer has just given, if you approach the private sector housing team and you're facing an eviction, private sector housing team doesn't actually deal with the eviction. We have another team in another department, in another part of the council that provides the advice on the eviction. Yeah. it can get complicated at that point, as you know, through caseworking yourself. But the housing officer in private sector housing generally always act, they are professionally qualified housing officers. They will always act, as far as possible, as the glue that holds the whole case together. But if in doubt, always refer it back to that person. Inevitably, these things are a bit more complicated. And as Councillor Member said, we take a soft kicking easily. But if there's something you want to make the recommendation, we will take that into account. Absolutely.
Thank you. We are now running over time. So Councillor Selma's question is going to be the last one in terms of private sector housing. And then we'll have to forego your presentation, I'm afraid, in terms of housing association, but we will move to questions from commission members. I'm very, very sorry. But we have all been provided with it. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's partly been, I think, picked up on in that answer, but just on the bit about, I guess, coordination between housing needs and private rent sector team. So we obviously discharge lots of people into PRS, and then I know that I sometimes pick up casework where there's then problems subsequently with that landlord. So do we use that, I guess we have a connection with that tenant in a way that we don't in lots of other contexts. Do we use that relationship, as it were, to make sure that those individuals have a really clear understanding about the PRS team and how they can come through? And I know that people often get a bit confused and come back to housing needs. Are we confident that then they get kind of redirected to the right place, either in terms of just normal follow-up with landlords or stuff that we can then help with?
I'm not wholly confident, Councillor Selma, that always happens in every case. And I'm not even necessarily 80% confident, okay, to be perfectly straightforward. It does happen though. Yeah, so, but you've hit the nail on the head. That's the main kind of referral route that we get caught up in loops with. It depends, if I was subjecting it to a scientific analysis, it tends to boil down to the relationships and the knowledge between the officers, as opposed to a process itself. But that's the one where you get the handoff. Homelessness, it goes back into the PRS, an issue raises. The way that we glibly and simplistically, but it's about the only way we can do it at the moment, get over it, say, just refer it back to private sector housing and we'll take it through the route and try and learn, et cetera, from it. But it's not 100% fail-safe at all.
And is there anything you think that would help improve that?
We have tried recently embedding staff in each other's team to get an improvement. That has worked. I don't know that a full merged service would work because it would be doing everything under the sun. I don't know. But I think the route that we're kind of going down that sort of picked up all the points, including what the chair said about adult social care, is having more and more of a fluidity and embedding between those three service areas. Yeah, that won't get us 100%, but I think if we're pushing the higher percentages on in terms of handoffs and referring it through as a case, we'll get better. At the moment, the model is the housing officer holds the case and manages it through the whole system. Yeah, that is probably about the only way we can do it. We can improve it, I think, by embedding a more professional. I mean, one of the other things I suppose I could do, if we had a bit more cash, is as well as recruiting a social worker, I could recruit my own a lawyer. I could recruit my own social workers into the team as well. In truth, there are possibilities there. We have thought about it, but at the moment, I am welcoming of your advice and etc. on this. We haven't got it right, that's all we do. I'm not doing the presentation, Chair, on RPs, is that right? Or...
Oh, very sorry, yeah, because we've only probably got another 15 to 20 minutes.
Right.
So do you want us to, we're still going to do RPs, or do you want us to come back some other time to do that?
You want to do if you could keep it to 5 minutes.
1 to 3.
Should I go through it at some break?
Okay, go
Do
for
your
it.
bit.
It would be helpful for the people that have come to
Come in,
have some
okay.
context as well.
Okay.
I will
Maybe,
try and
maybe
do it
not.
in 5 minutes. I'll get through it. Right, first slide. In a nutshell, housing associations they're all different, is what this slide says. There's no, that they're called housing associations, RSLs, they can be charities, they can be co-ops, all sorts. This is how, very important part of our partnership working. They are all different. Next one, please, Greg. Put you on the spot there. Governance and purpose. This is common to all of them. So there's a definition on the top. They're regulated by the Regulator of Social Housing. That's got, as you know, lately that we've firmed that out a lot since Grant held the Social Housing White Paper. So that's getting much stronger than the last time I did this presentation. As well, some RPs are not just registered with this, but they are charities too, and are registered by the Charity Commission. Next one, please, Craig. Different models. There are general ones in Hackney. There are specialist ones in Hackney. The size of them varies massively. North London Muslim Housing Association, less than 1,000 units of stock. Clarion, over 125. Geography varies. Some are very, very locally based. Clarion, again, for example, are in 170k. Some do development, some do management, some do all those things. Some don't do any of those things. Again, they're very different. Fashionable lately, a lot of our housing associations in Hackney have been subject to and are subject to mergers. So they're becoming mega organisations. The most recent one is Sanctuary, you know, big units. It makes them less accountable, all those things that we'll go on to in a minute. And the rise of the for-profit housing association. We don't have any for-profit housing associations in Hackney. I am holding the fort on that. Don't know how long, but I am holding the fort, councillors, on this. Every single day of the week I hold the fort on this. Final point on this one, I'd say, if anyone was to have I haven't got time to make you play the guessing game. We've got over 40 housing associations registered in Hackney. About 20, 25 we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Some of those 40 are literally very small. We have an arms house with 6 units, and we have a full gamut of stuff. Next one, please, Craig. These are the key characteristics. Assured fixed-term tenancies. They don't do secure tenancies like councils do. You know that. The rent reform bill will, of course, change the nature of tenancy. So the ASTs are going, but that's their basis at the moment. They don't have a right to acquire, but they don't have a right to buy. But they do have a right to acquire against councils, but it's still there. A lot of housing associations make their business by stock transfer. In Hackney, we are still dealing with the legacy 20 years ago. We're aware of them, Sanctuary, Peabody, etc. They don't offer a social rent in the way a council does. Remember that slide I showed you, 145 quid versus our 107. Many of them offer affordable, i.e. unaffordable rents. I just thought I'd mention the ones that are putting me under a lot of pressure. Sage, Resi and Aviva are buzzing around me on a daily basis to get themselves into Hackney, and they have got wedges of cash out of their pocket to get in here, develop, etc., etc. They are looking to get that first foothold in London, but you've heard of some of these. Again, I'll come back to those later. Thanks, Greg. RPs in Hackney, this gives you some idea. The stock figures on here. Sanctuary is the weird one. There's a naught missing off that. The Sanctuary stock should be nearly 3,000, but this gives you an idea. We haven't got Peabody on there. Peabody are our biggest. They've got about 6,000 units. So they put together the housing association stock is not that far different from the council stock in the borough. Okay. Right, RP Compact. One of the big things that Councillor Adajari and some of you were here before is we worked on putting a registered provider compact together for Hackney. So we spent the last year and a half before January working with virtually every RP in Hackney to produce an agreed partnership document, which we've done. It was approved by Cabinet in January this year. A key point is it is a partnership document. It is not a contract. It is not enforceable, but you'll be aware of the contract. There are 2 sub-areas of work that we are focusing on that we are going to make enforceable. The simple reason that these are major issues in Hackney. One is nominations. Well, that goes on anyway. We've got the nominations agreement. That is enforceable. And domestic abuse, it's a major issue in Hackney. So we're going to have a specific, as part of the compact, a specific domestic abuse pathway, policy and protocol, which we will insist the chief executive of the housing association signs up to. And we're working through that at the moment. That's great. We already have some existing partnerships in Hackney already, irrespective of whether we have a compact or not. We have an approved provider of housing in Hackney. You must meet a certain set of criteria. If you don't meet that criteria, you are not on our approved list. You can't develop in Hackney. There are 17 housing associations on our approved list. So not all housing associations in Hackney provide housing. We have the Better Housing Partnership is our forum in different words. 2 subgroups. One focuses on development and one focuses on management. Day-to-day liaison, day-to-day queries about housing associations go through the housing strategy team. So that's your single point of contact. As not just a thing and all of that, they'll refer it on, they'll casework it through. But anything Section 106 is planning, development, general queries all go through housing strategy as your protocol. One more, Craig. Can't see it, but we monitor complaints, we monitor data on a day-to-day basis across the piece. You will see if you, the column 1, 2, 3 in from the right, that's where all the complaints are, and that column is headed disrepair. 90% of my casework and me getting my head kicked in is around disrepair in bloody housing association stock. It is a nightmare. We can, as we said earlier, refer it to the private sector housing team, and we do refer it for enforcement. But the point is, social purpose organisations should not be having to be enforced against, and they should be doing their repairs. Bit of a double-edged sword, because I can put Hackney's percentage figures up there. I haven't done, but they're not dissimilar to some of our RP partners. So we just got to be careful as well and be mindful of our own role and our own stuff. Thanks, Craig. I've got another one, Count. My final apple and orange, which you may have seen before, is really where I'm trying to make the point that sometimes this is an interesting area of work, housing associations. They're partners. 20 years ago, I had some powers over housing associations. I have virtually nothing over them now. So I have to work very closely with them, close relationships and things like that. Often comparing even a big housing association with another big one is comparing an apple with an orange. They're very different personalities, very different ways of working, very different degrees of accountability across the whole piece. We, I say the council, Mayor Glanville, Council Member, we've been meeting with every single, well, the top 20 RPs by stock size over the last few months. The chief executives have been hoiked into the council, and we're going to do this annually now, so it starts from there. Like I say, they're very, very different beasts, and we need to be a very different way of working with them, which we've got the compact in place. It's really only been in place since March, so it's 3 months old now. It's a good idea for a scrutiny at some point to see how it's going, Councillor, but not yet. It's been in place for 3 months, so in a year's time, 18 months time, we'll start having a look at where we got to with that.
Thank you for doing that so quickly and so thoroughly at the same time. Much appreciated. Okay, look, Councillor Palace indicating, Councillor Selman, in that order, and then Councillor Councillor Garbutt, and then Councillor Joseph.
Great, thank you very much. So one of the things that we're getting from residents is around, basically having to wait on the phone for hours to get through to said housing association. Are we monitoring that? Do we have data around that? And are we holding kind of housing associations to account over things like that?
So this is where I step in and just refer us back to the fact that some day-to-day, so we deal with the actual substance of the complaint, not the process of the complaint. And so whether a Hackney resident is calling the council or a housing association, that if it's the council, there's a complaints process to deal with that. If it's a housing association, we can't instruct a housing association to fix that. But what ward councillors can do, if they're aware of that, is to raise casework as they would normally for the council, to speak to chief execs and others and operations directors. If we see a pattern, which has sometimes been the case, where a particular association has a number of those types of complaints, then we will hold them in and speak to them. But as James says, some of that is kind of like charming bees with honey, because we do want to make sure that that's fixed, but also we maintain that relationship. The worst thing in the world for everybody involved, but most importantly, the resident, would be if the housing association said, no, we don't care, which they could kind of do.
But we obviously hold data on complaints, or we don't, because
we don't. So we have to gather that data, Councillor Platt, which is literally all housing associations gather that data themselves. We ask them to share it with us. Some do, some don't. Some just tell us to get lost. And if they tell me to get lost, there's literally nothing I can do about it. Yeah, they all use different systems. They all use different. Yeah, and so I have to have an officer who's no longer here, he's left. I have to have an officer who literally does a manual phone around every quarter to gather all that data you saw in that form together. There's virtually no automated way in any borough in London where this happens. It's almost impossible. And if they tell me to clear off, they can tell me to clear off.
Would we consider trying to get the data for, average repair times, average waiting times on calls, for example?
So the point is that we do, but they don't have to tell us. Where we can get it, we do. But there is a question about at what point is it a good use of council officer, taxpayer time and money to do that if they're just, I mean, there are some, I won't name the ones which tell us to do one, but there are some who frankly should know better, whereas there are some who anything you want, they will provide it to you. And that is borne out by the type of casework and where a lot of it comes from.
And there's a problem with that as well, Councillor, because you then put up on a chart some RPs and you've got others on there and you can get into it, just doesn't look good. There's a reason, there may be a genuine reason why we haven't got data for one. You know, they all get, it's a bit of a nightmare.
I understand that. I guess this is the point around whether we can do anything to obviously, you know, share best practice or to get things moving. But I just want to get onto a second point, just around in the compact, and I may have missed this, but I'm just, as James will know, I'm very interested in maximising social housing on housing association land, because they are social landlords, and a lot of the stock they got in transfers for not that much money. So my question is, what levers are we kind of using? You know, and is this in the compact? Because I didn't quite pick it up. It may be, and I just around trying to maximise social housing on housing association sort of land.
Again, it is in the compact, absolutely is number one. Number two is bees and honey. Again, we can't force an RP, despite me trying to do it all of the time, we can't enforce, as you yourself know, through straightforward experience, Councillor, we can't enforce them. We use all sorts of different sticks, in terms of if you do this or we'll make life difficult there, we can say all that sort of stuff. But there is no straightforward way of enforcement. We do have the Mayor of Hackney Housing Challenge. Again, that's where we use our own right to buy receipts to as grant to provide social units. That's sort of 20 million quid. We've spent that straightforwardly. It depends upon right to buy receipts coming in, and it depends upon the question: should we be spending right to buy receipts on our own stock or RPs? There's all sorts of factors there. Do I have any powers? Again, no, I don't, Councillor. It is in the compact. And as Councillor Member also said, some of our associations are actually quite good at doing that stuff, and some aren't. And there's no rhyme or reason between good, bad, as you yourself know.
Just one point on that. Obviously, we've got a particular tenure mix that we push in our own housing strategy. How many housing associations in the borough do you think are getting close to that tenure mix?
They're nowhere near the tenure mix that we have. So our tenure mix in terms of regen, we only do 3 tenures. So outright sale, shared ownership, and social rent. Okay. A housing association, if it is going to be funded and supported by us through planning, must hit those 3 tenures. They have a degree of flexibility though, because they've got to buy land and everything else, and you're into questions then about viability, and they regularly ask us, can we push the rent levels a bit? And they do push those rent levels a bit. They are not equivalent to social rent, they're more expensive.
Thank you, Councillor Palace. Councillor Selman, do you want to wait, or you're okay?
I think actually the question I was going to ask has largely been covered. So I was going to ask about obviously the compact not being binding, and just to get a sense of how much has been buy-in from that. And given it might not be quick to answer that, I just took a tricky question, extra one, which was, you mentioned there's obviously quite a lot in the compact, which is about the VOG protocols, domestic abuse protocols. The same section also refers to people who are sort of who need to be moved due to concerns about gang-related violence. And I just wondered if there's a similar equivalent sort of protocol or process being developed, because it was a bit more quiet on that in the protocol, in the charter.
In reverse order, Councillor Selman. So we simply and solely, we haven't got the resources to do 2. We're doing VOG at the moment, and gangs is next. So watch this space. You're absolutely right. Gangs, criminality, and ASB is the next one. We want those as protocols that are signed up to, rather than partnership documents. Yeah. So that's next. We've got to get the ball through the door first. How binding is it? What we tried to do is land the compact. We had a good involvement of about 10 RPs up to chief exec level. That's good. There were some that didn't get involved. That's bad. But what we're going to try and do now is start the stone roll. We always knew we wouldn't get all 25. Let's get 10 through the door. Let's start to embarrass, name the others, and just try and get that stone growing over the next year. That's always been our strategy. That's pretty much all we can do at the moment. But we're going to use it to build momentum and impetus and get more sign up.
Can I? No, go ahead. Is there stuff that we as ward councillors could be doing more, where there's particular, large ones that have all got relationships and stuff, that we could do more to encourage people.
Just tell them to join the compact. Tell them to sign it, yeah. Especially Patrick and all that lot, just tell them, yeah, and we'll help you.
No names, James. Just really quickly wanted to add to Councillor Palace's question about the tenure mix that we have. So I think to add, I want to say something nice about housing associations, because I think we do have a commitment to maximise social housing, but as we've discussed at great length in the first part of this session, we have absolute dire need in the private rented sector, amongst others. And, once we subdivide into kind of supported accommodation, all that sort of stuff, we don't need just general needs, social rent housing. We need more of everything. Obviously, one of the things that we do via housing associations is shared ownership for those people that will never qualify for our housing list, even if we had enough for every single person that lived here. That essentially the children of those people that are in social housing now, I would say, to momentarily switch hats, at the GLA, the piece of work, casework that I get the most is from those people, not those people in social housing. But Peabody, for example, a few years ago was really good at demonstrating along with us proof of concept around making sure that there was private sector housing. So in the south, again, on that map, there are some Peabody developments which are providing private rent, and they're doing that in a way which demonstrates a rent escalator, which I think is really positive, because there are criticisms that they can't make money off a particular model. But actually, I think if we were to be more nuanced in the way that we look at when somebody says something is private, what is that private thing? If it's a rent-controlled flat in Hackney, and there are 300 of them somewhere in the south of the borough, I personally, it may not be shared, but I would say that that is a win, because that helps us towards our targets of having an increase in private rented sector accommodation. And in that immediate neighbourhood, it may have some impact over time in reducing the average cost locally.
10 seconds. So on that point, coming back to the first presentation as well, if we were to summarise in the housing strategy, I'd say we need a smaller but more professional private rented sector. And that's where that comes in. So not just RPs, but build to rent and things like that is where we want to be looking at for the future.
So these are all discussions that you're having amid the compact relationships that you have at the moment, looking forward. It's good to know.
It comes down to funding, it comes down to all the usual things, councils, but those discussions we've been having for a while.
So prior to any building going on, you would kind of be no.
We work with the housing association to look at their scheme,
Okay.
whatever it is. Yeah,
Okay.
and if it's appropriate, that it's about. I mean, as council said, we don't have it. We need housing supply of all sorts in this borough. We don't have enough of everything, including private rented stock. Yeah, so whatever the RP is proposing to us, we will look at.
Thank you very much. Councillor Garbutt, and then Councillor Joseph.
I mean, yeah, a lot of it's been covered by the extensive conversation around the compact. Mine was more like, how are we monitoring? I know it's very early days, but what are the plans to kind of monitor the strategic priorities of the compact? Like, how do you know? How will we know? And I know you said about coming back here, and I think that would be really good sometime next year. But yeah, just on that, priorities.
Again, straightforward, Councillor Garbutt. So when we wrote the compact, we wanted one that was deliverable. We didn't want one that had 730,000 targets in, because it would be just ridiculous. So we split it down into what we thought were deliverable, smart, intelligent targets on a year-by-year basis that were agreed by partners. Okay. At the moment, I only have basically 1/3 of a resource to manage that. We're getting resources in over the year. We've only implemented it in March to monitor that compact over the next 5 years of its life. That's the glib answer.
So that's within your team, and then does it go any? Is it going to go in? Like, is there a governance structure around it, or is it just your team kind of?
So firstly, the housing strategy team at the moment will monitor the compact. There may be some discussions around that, because you could challenge me and say, how many specialist staff have you got? And I'm going to have to answer none. So I actually do think we need specialists or partnership RP workers, and I'm making a business case for that, number one. And number two, we are looking under the development of the housing strategy, and we'll be consulting on this in summer, the governance of the whole of the RP working arrangements in Hackney under both the housing strategy itself and the compact. At the moment, I said we've got the Better Renting Partnership. Do I think that works? I think it works partly, but it could do a lot better. And we are open to all views. We're looking at what other boroughs are doing on how that whole thing works.
Yeah, I'd really welcome that as ward councillors as well, us being really involved in that consultation, just because of the work that we've been doing, holding them to account as well. But yeah, that sounds really good.
Yeah, just to reassure members, I think we discussed briefly at a full council a while ago, but as James says, that document was promised last May and is in development, and there will be a full process where it will be brought to members, it will come to cabinet, there will be a consultation. So absolutely, when that does happen, I would strongly encourage people to participate and encourage your residents to do so. And in addition, if the commission, has particular areas that they think would strengthen the monitoring of the effectiveness of the compact, that's also something that we would welcome. We'd ask for not too many metrics though, because realistically, if you ask for 50 things, it's just not going to happen, as we know. But if there are things which mean that we're able to have a better understanding of our stock and of our residents, then we'd be open to that and report back to you as and when you want.
I mean, first do, Councillor Carpet, I get the full stuff out the door, get the nominations agreement looked at. So it's basically 3 to 5 key actions deliverable a year across the partnership landscape.
Thank you very much. Please be assured, Councillor Moema, we will make a submission at your request. Thank you. Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to start with resident engagement. In terms of tenants associations in housing association estates, there's quite a few in operation. I'm just wondering how you work with them. Do you keep records of them? Do you encourage them, or do you collaborate in any way with them? Is the first point. And then the second point, if I may, is I mean, I was personally very glad Mayor Glanville was recently meeting with some of the major housing associations. I mean, currently, in some ways, it does seem a little bit up to individual councillors to develop our working relationships with the housing association managers or housing officers. And obviously, there is quite a lot of turnaround and movement in that sector. So some of us have contacts and we communicate quite regularly. But I'm just wondering if it would be useful, and I think I have raised this sort of informally before with Councillor Moema, to kind of create a bit of a database of contacts just to make communication and advocacy easier for councillors on behalf of residents. So I just wondered if that was something that, you know, we might all be able to contribute to. Thank you.
Yeah. Just really quickly on that, I do remember after you raised that, Councillor Joseph, with me, I did discuss it with James and the team. And yes, in principle, but much like the reporting that associations do, there is no one mechanism that any of them use to do that. But we are still looking at it basically. What's the most practical way? Because the worst thing is, which we've had in the past, which is partly why bits of the Better Renting campaign have come down, that you have a website and that is not actually job done. You'll end up with a number of dead links, and that's not particularly useful if we're directing people to something which is not up to date or which doesn't reflect where associations are. So we just need to figure out the best way to do that, because also what I think I'm quite resistant to is that every single time a councillor has a piece of casework, which is, if you're talking about the TRAs, for example, that's their own housing association's governance. There is a fine line between kind of being kept up to speed and then the people in the PRS team being copied into every single piece of casework and becoming a casework function for a landlord, which is not the council. We need to find a way to strike that balance. So I've absolutely heard you, and I know that the team are working on it, but we haven't figured out how to answer your question yet, which is useful but not onerous on everybody involved. But to have some kind of monitoring, you are right.
Just to follow on, Councillor Joseph, so Councillor Member's point there is the reality is that every single housing association has a procedure up to and including the ombudsman that should resolve these issues. Should, okay? That's the way the world is set up to work. That should work that way. When we have a whole range of reasons why we get involved and don't get involved, as Councillor Member has said, we do have contacts of databases across the organisations that we use as officers regularly. partly the problem we have given them to councils before. The problem then becomes the housing association ignores them, it gets referred back, and it all becomes a mess. So we're looking at this constantly. Housing associations are different too. You may find in your ward you've got housing officers who are present in that ward. You may find in another ward the housing officer is based in Wembley or Hillingdon or somewhere else. It's a very different way of some answer quite quickly, some don't. It's a real hodgepodge. So we are looking at this. I don't know we'll ever have a completely straightforward and agreeable answer, but definitely at the moment, it goes through the housing association. Get officers involved as a last port of call if you have to, and we'll pick it up that way.
Can I make a suggestion, actually? Because I know you asked a little while ago, Councillor Joseph. We have the we're really focused on making sure that we progress the re-licensing and our permissions for the new scheme by the beginning of autumn. Can we, James, have something to come back to the Commission by October?
In terms of the communication database? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
We can ask Constantine. So we'll come back to you in October with something, hopefully with that resolved. And if not, feel free to give us a kicking, but we will get it fixed.
Yeah, we'll come back with something that we think resolves it, as opposed to guaranteeing one. Communication with RPs is the bane of my life, along with private sector landlords, obviously. But we'll have another think and get back to you later in the year.
Okay. Did you want to do a follow-up, Sam?
I was just wondering whether, because Councillor Joseph has raised this in previous sessions relating to Hackney around illegal disrepair and the amount we spend on illegal disrepair. I just wonder whether an incentive to the housing associations potentially to get, work getting done on this is that we can, find resolution before, you go stage 1, stage 2, housing ombudsman, and then, you have illegal disrepair. I suspect they're spending a similar amount to what we as a council are spending on it. So I just wonder whether that's something we could use as an incentive to try and take that cost down.
Yeah, again, Councillor, you're absolutely right. But in brutal reality, we've got some big RPs out there who just ignore us in terms of that incentive as well. And I'll be sure I'm not pulling punches here. They just ignore me, including up to deputy chief exec level, chief exec sometimes, and that is a real problem. A difficulty I then have is I start firing big guns, the big guns miss, and we undermine. It can be really difficult sometimes. But you are right, and we do try and do that. We've got the comms links. We know who they are. It's just how we best use them with councillors to achieve the best. Because you'll have the resident, you'll have the tenant there on a day-to-day basis, quite distressed on your case, getting nothing out of the RP. You get involved, you get nothing either. That's the problem we find in some cases, and we've got to avoid that plague.
I just want to quickly add to that. So one of the things, really important to registered providers will be their G1 and their V1 or otherwise ratings, so their governance and viability ratings. And I know there are times when councillors will say, is this something that I, as deputy member, can raise for them? And I can, but what is equally, if not more important to me, and making sure that we progress this bit of the portfolio, is the chipping away to have members' inquiries in exactly the same way that you would advocate for your residents, with council services to do exactly the same with RPs, because those ratings are actually either directly or indirectly impacted by the service levels that their tenants and shared owners receive. If there are no complaints to an RP, then they will think everything is fine. If they do have, then that gives a tenant or a leaseholder somewhere to go when it comes to a complaint or legal issues or an ombudsman case, in much the same way that they would with us. So just chipping your casework makes much more of a difference than you think it does, because that is the kind of thing that they then does appear in the stats when they get back to us.
Kind of finish off here. I've just got a quick question in terms, compacts in its infancy, ongoing evolution as time goes on. But within, I'm just interested, we've been doing work in partnership with housing associations as well as council rentals, which have nothing to do with you, in respect of mould and damp. Within that, has there been any feedback from our more transparent housing associations in respect of stock condition surveys, level of disrepair, and the steps that they're taking to kind of ameliorate those problems? Is that something that's happening? Is that something we are monitoring?
Something we're doing, Councillor Adajari. So one of the standard agenda items on every meeting between the Mayor of Hackney and the Chief Executive, agenda item number 1 is damp and mould. We ask them what they are doing, what their figures are, etc., and we've captured that, and we're monitoring and talking to them that on a quarterly basis on damp and mould and fire safety specifically. What we aim to do is just do a bit more of that on other subjects as well. But in terms of damp and mould itself, so at the moment we know, for example, as of today's date, as far as I'm aware, we only have 2 Category 1 damp and mould cases across the entire housing association stock in Hackney. Category 1's dangerous to life or limb. They're both in one housing association whose name I'm not allowed to mention. So I won't tell you. So that, you know, we have that data down almost to the individual unit. So we can do things. You know, you can get that when there's a lot of impetus behind the sector. Again, as Councillor Member said, there are G1s, V1, all that sort of stuff with the regulator. But we're doing that outside of that, almost as it were. But again, the amount of effort that's being put in the Mayor's office, the housing strategy team, just to get that stuff back. What we're trying to is the magic wand here is regularizing that kind of data across the piece. We're nowhere near that yet. Damp and mould, fire safety, I'm relatively able to sleep in my bed at night with the private sector stock. Some of the other things we discussed tonight, way to go.
Okay, and just another quick one in terms of reaching out to residents. I know increasingly a lot of our housing association private sector rentals are owned separately and rented out to people. But I'm not sure in terms of the connection with the PRS team, whether that's something that our residents are necessarily aware of. Are you doing more also? You've done lots of good work over the past few years, but are you doing also more to publicise what you do to people in those kind of circumstances, so they're aware of this as well? Because walking around, I'm not
So
sure.
you're saying somebody who is a private tenant of a housing association?
Yeah. Although they would then go to their landlord who may not also necessarily respond in the right, because everything is on the landlord as opposed to the housing association in the first instance.
But so I think in our discussion, we need to remember that the housing association is the landlord, in much the same way that the council is, or a private person is a landlord. So that's where the relationship gets difficult. Because housing associations are regulated, but private landlords are not, our starting point is, and we can look at this if the Commission wants to recommend otherwise, our starting point is the housing association sector and everybody that lives in it is regulated, and there are penalties, and we might want them to be stricter, but there are penalties if something happens. That applies to the private tenants as well as the social tenants there. And so it's difficult to see what we would be offering that the landlord shouldn't be doing, that the regulator, the housing regulator, is telling them to do. So if the housing association is not meeting its regulatory obligations, that's when we would step in. In the case of, for example, leaseholders, shed owners having problems with the landlord, we might enter into I don't want to say we enter into the dispute, because we don't, because it becomes a legal issue and we don't want to spend, we have to be careful with the limited amount of money that we have, but we will enter into looking at what is the equivalence with what we are providing to people who have a quote unquote genuine private landlord who is not regulated. The issue with the private rented sector is that there is no regulation, because the other thing is as well, I've used the example of Peabody, the one benefit of having associations as private landlords over private landlords is not to kind of discount the many good private landlords that there are, but the housing associations already have a management structure, and it's generally just a lot easier for them to do their rent increases or decreases in exactly the same ways they do for their social tenants. So in practice, that's what happens. So they don't call it a rent control, but they're effectively, quite often, the increase is, it's higher than a social rent, the increase, by a long way. but it still is controlled somehow. And so the next part of the work that we need to look at, this will be, I think, years down the line. I hope it would be lovely to be months, but is affordability. And at least there is some semblance of a control around increases in affordability if you're a private sector tenant of a housing association compared to a private landlord where there's just nothing. Which is why it's really important to us that we maintain a good relationship with those people so that they don't, which they're entitled to do, flip those homes to become homes for sale. And overnight, people lose their homes, which is also the worst situation we could ever face here in the borough if landlords just sell up and leave.
Just again, Councillor, so yeah, it's in theory or in practice, it's much easier to deal with that example because you're dealing with a professionalised landlord, number one. There's a fundamental point here though, the team will triage the case that's in front of them without fear or favour. So in a sense, it doesn't matter whether it's referred to us from Peabody, from the London Renters Union, or what, we will deal with it upon the merits of that case in front of us. And we will treat equitably and equally everybody that the team favours, the team in front of the team. And that's the fundamental point of how it operates. Ultimately, we will treat, in this instance, we're saying Peabody, we will treat Peabody as a private landlord, no differently. If they don't do it, then they get an enforcement notice, then we do. Section 215, you name it. But what we won't do necessarily is go, and what we haven't done, maybe we could, but we don't necessarily go out to outreach those particular tenants of Peabody any more than we would any other tenant within the private rented sector for reasons of frankly, equality.
Okay, so the fact they're regulated makes it a very different process. So a leaseholder of a housing association who the property is then rented out to somebody, the grounds for enforcement on behalf of the authority differ from somebody? No.
So if the leaseholder has their property, they move out and they have a tenant, the leaseholder is the landlord. So that is the circumstance in most cases because we have lots of flats here. So that is a normal relationship. If in some cases, I would like it to be more, if I'm getting too technical, but you have like the head lease and the freeholder is owned by the housing association. The lease is owned by the housing association, and that person is a private tenant rather than a social tenant. That is where the person in the property is a tenant of the housing association. If your landlord is a leaseholder, in practice, we don't really behave differently, but the reality is as well that if you're in the second situation where let's say Association X is the landlord, is the leaseholder, we expect that Association X will deal with you in a more professional way than somebody who owns one or two places and doesn't, it's not professional. In practice, if you have a complaint, you are equally entitled to come to the council as a tenant living in this borough of a private landlord, irrespective of who they are. But in terms of resolution, the team will have other avenues because there will be a team of people at the housing association who they can go to, who, because they are a regulated entity, there are some obligations that they have to the tenant which don't exist in the private sector. So there are we are more hands-on with somebody who is in, if you like, the proper private sector than somebody who is in housing association, unless it's a leaseholder and tenant dispute, in which case it's all the same. But the outcome should be the same.
The thing that my starting point was a leaseholder tenant, so it kind of got mixed up. But okay, that's good to know. But I don't think that many people are aware of that level of kind of involvement on the part of the local authority, and that was my kind of point at the beginning. But thank you for clarifying. We've got Councillor Palace is fine. Okay, final one from Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. Mine is on the auctioning off of our social housing properties by housing associations. It seems to be happening with an increased frequency in my experience. I'm just wondering how we collaborate with residents and housing association partners to try and make sure this doesn't happen, and in the event that it does happen, what powers do we have to buy them and rent them out as our own council homes? Because sometimes it's been a bit frustrating where I've really hoped that we've been able to intervene there. That hasn't hasn't happened. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Joseph. So we don't have any power to stop a housing association from selling its stock if it wants to, number one. What we've done in Hackney is we've put in place the sales protocol. So this is a protocol between the council and housing associations which governs what they do when they want to dispose of a home. Number one, there's five parts on the waterfall here. Number one, we say to them, don't sell it. Do everything you can to keep it, whatever you've got to do. Number two, if you are going to sell it, give us a good reason for why you're selling it. It can't be just because you've made a property up because you're in Victoria Park. Right, that's number two. Number three, if you are going to sell it, offer it to the council first and foremostly at a good rate. Yeah. Number four, if the council doesn't want it, offer it to another RP. The council will help you match you with a partner so the unit can be kept in Hackney. Number five, if none of those four stages work beforehand and you have to sell the property, keep the receipt within the borough of Hackney, preferably the ward in which it's sold. That is our protocol. That is signed up to by the RPs. Again, a lot of RPs do stick to that protocol, but a lot don't, and a lot of stuff is sold through auctions that we don't know about. What the team do, we write to chief execs, we write sniffy letters, etc., and we try and work in partnership. Again, we don't have any powers over this. I'm at the moment buying some stuff off of Peabody. They are following protocol and we are buying things. There are some RPs that never tell me when they're selling their stuff and I find out on auction day. We have met with chief executives and we put this to them. Some chief executives have been very sympathetic and do follow it. Some chief executives have said to us, it's within my rights to rationalise my own stock and I will do what I want. And they've said that openly, but we are where we are. There's not a lot we can do on that point, but try and work and put pressure on them in other ways. The sales protocol is there. It's part of the compact. It's part of the housing strategy. We try and make it work as much as we can. Some areas get more sales than others, Councillor. Unfortunately, in your ward, as you know, you've got quite a lot going on there.
Thank you very much. So just to kind of clarify, so historically, the properties that were sold off, no caveats or protections in place in terms of later return to the authority, so they're just gone. But at the moment, in terms within the compact, there is some, as you said, receipts kept in borough. Is a change to that approach? Okay.
So just briefly, Councillor, so we found a total mess in terms of the stock transfer documents and the legacy protections. Some had like phrases in there that you would offer to the council as the first thing. Some parts of the borough, they put covenants in place. Some were just Wild West open. It was a total and utter mix. And that's where we've been able to find the documentation that related to stock transfers and all that sort of stuff. A lot of it, I've no idea where it is. It's been stored in legal archives back in the year 2000, 2001. We don't know where it is. Yeah. That's why we brought the protocol in to cut through all of that and say no matter what your circumstances are, no matter where you are historically, you will abide by the protocol and offer it to us. Don't sell it, first of all. Keep it, invest in it, what have you. They come back to us and say, look, it's not viable, or we'll buy it, etc.
Thank you very much, and that's very good to know. We're going to bring this session to an end now. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here today. Likewise, both our observers. We appreciate you being here. Round of applause for you. You sat through it all. As some suggestions have already been made in terms of coming back to you with ideas and suggestions and potential for further review, we will be doing that, and we hope you'll be appreciative of our contributions. But again, thank you so much for being here this evening. But look forward to hearing from us. Thanks, Keith. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, she's got over it. So final item on the agenda, a bit later than scheduled, is the Living in Hackney work programme. We'll ask to consider the suggestions for the work programme for the next municipal year. The papers in the agenda provide information about how our function and remits. And accompanying this is the criteria to help guide members' decision-making for selecting a topic. It should also be noted that the overview and scrutiny annual public consultation is currently live and will close on the 22nd of June. We'd be interested to know, it asks residents and stakeholders for their suggestions for future work programmes, so feel free to submit it. All the information is online if you're interested. But we have to wait until that information comes back in terms of finalising our own work programme. So we have some suggestions already put forward. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on anything at this stage, or whether we're going to hold back until July. Okay.
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. You go, Zoe.
Go ahead.
Go.
Thank you. And I know we cover a really broad amount of topics on this commission, and I think it's so some that have been suggested that have come from organisations or residents to me already. I know there's a suggestion around homelessness and rough sleeping, but recently Councillor Potter and I met with gendered intelligence and some residents following the trans rights motion that we brought to full council and was approved a couple of months ago. And they were specifically talking about trans and gender diverse people, particularly young people, but their risk of homelessness and the kind of overrepresentation of trans and gender diverse people in the kind of homelessness or at risk population. And I know it's talking about at risk, but if that I would be really supportive of us looking at the needs of that population, just because it's kind of come from, you know, the commitment we've made through that motion, as well as, you know, an organisation coming to us to talk. And they've done, Gendered Intelligence, the organisation, have done a lot of resident engagement themselves and said they could help kind of get kind of that resident voice involved in that as well.
Okay, thank you. But within that also, I do think mental health and minoritized groups, again, are highly reflected in terms of the data. So perhaps an all-encompassing piece potentially. Thank you very much. Any more?
One of the perennial themes I get in casework, and others may get this as well, is about street properties and the council in relation to street properties and repairs, and also resident voice on street properties. And I just think in our previous discussion on repairs, often street properties don't come through, and there's a lot which is actually going on, and it would be really good to get an idea of what that looks like. I do also think it will be interesting whether, and I think I suggested this in the past, about whether there could be deep dives around the issue of repairs, whether there could be some kind of working group of the committee which may be met, I don't know, every 6 months, you know, just to look at that. Because I'm, you know, previously we talked about illegal disrepair and how high that is, you know, and the committee has to cover so much, of course. I mean, you could do a deep dive in lots of elements of what we're doing, police, for example, as well. But I just think obviously repairs are perennial. And then just final thing, I presume we're going to wait for the survey to think about a review, but are there any ideas at the moment for a kind of a review that we might do as a commission? And do we have an idea of how many like sessions we would dedicate to that review, for example?
Not as yet. I didn't want to be authoritarian and just, so it is taking on board what's said here and both what we receive in submissions, and then identifying which is the most kind of appropriate to take forward over the next, which ones are the most appropriate, and within that, which one constitutes doing a review or a deeper dive. Having said that, in terms of repairs, we have now asked for quarterly updates in terms of the data, which will help potentially, if a couple of us at least want to do that kind of deeper delve into the data and kind of analysis of what's going on and what needs to be done to kind of both support the organisation and identify areas of concern. So thank you, Councillor Palace. Councillor Thelman.
So one of the things I talked about with Councillor Conway when I was on doing across the Scrutiny Commission was about doing essentially a joint piece which was on the community safety partnership, so the whole partnership response to so the thing we had the conversation about was about approach to drug in the borough, which was looking at, because it was obviously the session that Living in Hackney did, which was looking at the police response, but had quite an adult focus.
Yeah.
And then we had talked about it in the CYPS, so we've had lots of conversations about coming at it from our youth services perspective in terms of substance misuse. And the long-standing concern, which isn't just in this context, but about how as a partnership that we look at that in a holistic way. So we don't, the bit where we can be off here talking about the police response to something, and then we're having a conversation off in CYPS about looking at it much more from a safeguarding child wellbeing perspective. And those two things don't always meet. And I think we've done quite a lot of things about doing joint sessions, but if you want to do something, a deeper dive around about that also being having the focus on that aspect of it might also allow for that broader focus about how we better marry up the youth services strand with the criminal justice strand, recognising that we're meant to be a single partnership. So yeah, that was one thing. And then the other was that obviously the commission did the one-off item bit on sort of advice services, which was mainly about coming off register. But there was only so much that it was possible to get into in that session. And I think there is something about how, think about it with reviews, where we can potentially add value. I personally feel from casework and things that there could be a lot of it'd be interesting to think about what best practice is, but how you support people when they approach housing needs in terms of advice, or people who are in temporary accommodation who approach it. I think that feeds into sort of a cultural thing about us getting. So I think we've tried to adopt something which is also about being honest with people about things, and then how that then manifests itself. And I think it'd be an interesting piece about understanding what does that look like, how do we get that right, where's best practice elsewhere as well.
Thank you very much. A lot more to add to the list. Thank you, colleagues. No, you know what? Yeah, it's going to be a tough call, really. So thank you for those suggestions this evening. We're drawing to an end now. We've got the minutes of the meeting of the 20th of April 2023, which were included with the agenda. They're just for members to note and agree and advise of any errors or any corrections they'd like made. We're hoping there are none. We're looking at Councillor Palace, no? Thank you. Noted. And final agenda item 8, any other business? Is there any other business? Thank you very much, everybody. As there is no other business, I formally declare the meeting closed. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, everybody who's online. Councillor Joseph also, and thank you to Craig Player for supporting us this evening.